Okay, so I have your completed data tables here for the brightest stars and the nearest stars. And what we'd like to do is make this graph. So luminosity on the y-axis, temperature on the x-axis, and the brightest and the nearest separated out. So I can start with either group. Let me just start with the brightest since they're on the left, and then we will do the nearest. We'll add the nearest to the graph. So just remember, I want temperature on the x-axis, luminosity on the y-axis. And the luminosity I want is L divided by L sun, so it's relative to the sun's luminosity. Okay, so the columns that I want are this column, column D, with the temperature data, and L over L sun. So in order to get both of those columns together, let me highlight the first one, and then scroll up. And I also want to highlight this. Now if I just clicked here, it would take me out of this column, and I want to keep that column highlighted. So if you're on a Mac, it's the Apple key. If you're on a PC, it's the Control key. You hold it down, and I'm holding it down, and then I can click and drag over this column. So now I've let go of everything, and I have those two columns highlighted: temperature, luminosity relative to the sun. And I'm making a scatter plot. So now I'm going up to Insert, and then I will choose the scatter plot. Okay, I don't need the lines connected or anything. I'm just going to pick the basic scatter plot. Okay, now all the data are scrunched up on the bottom, but that's because I don't have a logarithmic scale here. So the numbers that are really large, the stars with really, really high luminosities, are dominating the graph, and everything else gets crunched along the bottom. So if I go back to my example graph here, you'll notice that it is a log scale. So each line is 10 times bigger than the other. So the first thing I'll do, and well, let me make it bigger, so it'll be easier to see. Let me click on the axis. So the axis is highlighted. I just clicked on it. And then I will right click on it. Now this brings up a menu where I can choose to format the axis. All right, so now that I can get into this menu, I can choose how this axis is formatted. And the thing that I'm most interested in here is making this a logarithmic scale. So I'll select that option, and it automatically puts it in base 10, which is good. That's what I had on the other graph, so it'll look right. Okay, so let me exit out of that for a second. And now you can see that the data is spread out in a way that we can see where the individual dots fall along the luminosity axis. But it doesn't look quite right, and that's because the x-axis needs to be plotted backwards. So the way that HR diagrams work, the high temperatures are on the left and the low temperatures are on the right, so we need to switch that around. So now I'm going to click on the x-axis, and then right-click on it, format that axis. And now that brings me up to the same menu I had for the y-axis, but instead of putting this in a log scale, I'm just going to put this values in reverse order. Okay, so now I have the graph. The data looks better, right? So it's going from lower right to upper left. That's what we expect in an HR diagram. And then there's a population of stars up here. Now this is the brightest stars. So if you want to label them as the brightest stars, you can right-click on any data point in the set. So let me just pick this one. I'll right-click on it. And then you'll find an option to select data. You can also get here, I believe, by going to the Data tab. No, not Data tab, sorry. Chart Design or Format. Chart Design. So Chart Design option gives you the option to select the data. Okay, and now it brings you into this menu box where you can choose what data is plotted here. And the first thing I want to do is label this one appropriately. These are the brightest stars. So there's only one series of data on here, so that's this one. This is where the series get listed. And it's choosing the name by default to be whatever the y-axis column is. So it's labeling it L over L sun. But I want this to be named something else. Let me call this one the brightest. Okay, so let me click OK. I'm going to end up wanting to come back into this menu, but let me click OK. Okay, and now the label of the graph changes. But I only have one series on here, so it's not doing anything else. Next, I'll add in the nearest stars. So I want the nearest stars on this graph as well. So I'll go back into the select data box, which you can get to, as I said before, right-clicking on a data point. You can choose select data, or you can come up to the chart design and go to select data that way. All right, so now I'm adding a series. So I'm going to click the plus symbol to add a series, and it calls it series 2. I want to call it the nearest stars, and I'm going to choose the x and y values individually. So I'll click this little button here, and that will allow me to select the x values that I want, which will be this column. All right, so I selected those x values, and then I can select the y values. So now again, I want the L over L sun column, which is this one. Okay, so I have the x values selected, the y values selected. I labeled the series, so when I click OK, they should appear on that graph, and they do. So now I have all of the data there, both sets. We have the brightest stars and the nearest stars. You can change lots of things here. You can change where the x and y axis cross. So a couple of other things I did on this graph was I set it so the y axis crosses over here at a temperature of, I don't know what it is, like 4,000, 3,000 or something like that. And I made the y-axis cross at 0.00001, just so it frames the data nicely, and it looks more like you'd expect the graph to look. Whereas in the default here, it's choosing this to be the location of the x-axis and this to be the location of the y-axis. These are all cosmetic things. But one thing that you should do is label the data sets. So you want to have data labels on here. Okay, so I went back to chart design, and I can add chart element. And let's see, we want a legend. So the legend will tell me what each series is, and you can pick wherever you want it. Let me put it on to the, I guess I'll put it on the bottom. Brightest stars, nearest stars. Now I have a label, it looks all right. The brightest stars are in the top of the luminosity. The nearest stars tend to be not quite as bright. And we have our graph.